Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Lee and Kenny, for our music this morning. This is New Year's Day as far as Sunday school goes. We began a new church year, and we initiated a quarter studying the book of Genesis and looking forward to that. We're sort of going parallel to Davis's sermons, but I think the two tracks will enrich each other. And I look forward to these 3 months together. About 8 years ago, some researchers at Emory University studied adolescents and the degree to which they understood their family stories. And they found that children or adolescents who understood some of the stories of their family, some of the background, were more ready for the formation of their identity than those who did not know those stories. Yes.
I apologize for interrupting you, but that microphone does need to be turned up.
Okay.
Yes, you've got a little bit softer voice than Mr. Max does.
Okay. Okay. Is this better?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
It's fine.
But the researchers at Emory, as I say, found that those adolescents who knew their family stories, or many of them, had stronger identities than those who didn't. I don't know whether this can be applied directly. It's really not a direct application, but as we began Genesis 1, we began our story. This is our story. And you know the beautiful words, you've heard them since childhood. For this first Sunday, we'll go to the first 13 verses of Genesis 1 and then take up at verse 14 next week. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless, void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening, and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. The 6 days of creation, 3 of which we cover in this lesson, are told from the perspective of an observer standing on the surface of the earth. This is a man-centered telling of this story from the very beginning. So the account is earth-centered. The 6 days of creation are marked by the recurring phrase, "There was evening and there was morning." In 6 of these days, there are 8 creative acts of God. In each act, each act is introduced with the expression "God said." And on the third day and the sixth day, God did two creations. So that's sort of an overview of the 6 days. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God, in the Hebrew, is the word Elohim, which is a plural noun that takes a singular verb. It is a plural of majesty and can connote plurality within the Godhead. Now, this is a long way from the doctrine of the Trinity that will emerge in the 1st century AD, but I think this term Elohim allows for what will happen later in biblical theology. The word created used here is bara, B-A-R-A, and it's used only when God is the subject of the sentence. Man does not create in the sense of bara. Only God brings out of nothing that which is new. And that's the way that verb is used throughout Genesis. God created the heavens and the earth. This expression, heavens and earth, is what is called a merism. It's where you have more than one object that the combination of them really points to just one reality. An example of this is from the law, where you have the expression last will and testament. In the early days of the law, will and testament were two separate documents, each of which had to be processed in two different courts. But today, you have your will and testament, and that's just one document. So God creates the heavens and the earth, and this first verse is really a summary of what's going to come. God is the eternal reality, having no beginning, having no end. There was never a time when God did not exist, and there never will be a time when he doesn't exist. In this verse and throughout the 5 books of Moses, Israel's view of God is set in sharp contrast with their neighbors to the east in Babylon, their neighbors to the west in Egypt. The understanding of creation in both the Babylonian and the Egyptian cultures is that the gods emerge out of a primal soup, and they have not always existed. They emerge out of this primal material. They create in turn. They create human beings and other animals, but this is not like the God of Israel, who is self-existent from all eternity. In the Babylonian account of creation, the Enuma Elish, you actually have conflict between the god Marduk and the female Tiamat. In that conflict, Marduk slays Tiamat and cuts her into 2 pieces. One part becomes heaven and the other part becomes earth. So you can see that Israel's neighbors had quite a different understanding of how things came to be than Israel did in this Genesis account. In the second verse, we see that the earth was formless. It was formless, void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. This is even before the first day of creation. It's part of the summary, going with verse 1, showing that the initial phases of creation were empty and unfit for life. Water covered the surface of the earth. It was dark on that surface, and God would then reveal what would take place in the days following. Verse 3 is the first day of creation then, following the summary that we see in verses 1 and 2, where God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. It's like from morning has broken, this light springing fresh from just a word from God. And God saw that light, it was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, calling the light day and calling the darkness night. And then on the second day of creation, God creates a dome in the midst of waters. The picture that we get there was that creation was pretty watery, and God separated the waters so that some were above, and we would call them clouds now, from which water comes down to water the earth, and then waters on the surface of the earth. The dome was pictured by this observer as holding up the water that we call the clouds. It was sky. Again, from a very human perspective on the surface of the earth. And then the waters which cover the earth, and people who have studied tectonics, the mechanisms that underlie the surface of the earth, have confirmed that for much of Earth's initial history, it was covered by water. And so in the third day of creation, God separates the waters on earth and brings out the earth, the dry land. And on that dry land, he plants vegetation, described here as plants yielding seed for future production, and then fruit trees and other kinds of plants that have seeds within them, again, for the purpose of continued development of the creation here on earth. I'd like to stop at this point or shift gears. It's often said, Davis has said in his introductions to Genesis, that this account is not a scientific account, and he's right in that. It's not a mythological account, as we see from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. It's a very unique kind of literature, a very elevated, concise description of the steps of God's creation. Even though it's not a scientific explanation, I think our science today, science at any point, can greatly help us appreciate this account of creation. It illuminates and enlarges our understanding of creation. I have here a visual representation of our galaxy. What is the name of our galaxy? Milky Way. Here is the center of the Milky Way, and that is an area of intense energy, an area in which there is very strong gravitational pull. And in order for Earth and our sun, our star, which is called sun, to form, at one point it had to be closer to the center of the Milky Way than it now is. It was closer in order to take in some of the heavy elements that would be required for the kind of life we experience on Earth. But at some point, that sun, as one astronomer said, was radically kicked out of the closeness to the center. It's not kicked out to the periphery because the sun and the planets that surround it could not develop out there. But there is what I would call a sweet spot right here where you see this arrow. That is where our sun and the solar system exist in our galaxy, the Milky Way. It's really a sweet spot where life as we know it can exist. In addition to that fine tuning that allowed our sun to take on the elements that it needed to convey the elements required for life on Earth, God established our solar system in a marvelous way that I think illuminates how finely tuned our universe is. One of the most interesting facts about the solar system is this planet Jupiter. It's a massive planet that is 2.5 times the weight of the other planets in the solar system combined. And this planet has a critical function in the protection of the Earth. You have, coming from outer space at all times, asteroids and comets that, if it weren't for Jupiter and the next two planets, Saturn and Neptune, we would be obliterated. In 1994, there was a comet that came across space. It was named the Shoemaker-Levy comet. There were 21 portions of that comet that landed on Jupiter, and each of those caused a 10,000-mile fireball on Jupiter. So you can imagine if Jupiter had not blocked those, what it would have done to planet Earth. So we are in great debt to God for his fine tuning of our solar system that protects us from these kind of elements coming in. Also, one of the nice things about where God has placed us in the Milky Way is that we have a path of vision not only to the Milky Way, but astronomers say that they can see other galaxies, and indeed they can see to the beginning of time. That's why they've been able to confirm what's called the Big Bang Theory that is associated with the calculations, the equations that Albert Einstein came up with in his theory of general relativity. I've just scratched the surface here in describing some of the unique features of the universe that God has finely tuned to enable us to experience a planet like this. I take this planet for granted. I have taken it for granted all of my life because I've been so close to it. But when you see the process of its creation, you see God's fine tuning in making it possible and sustaining it, it certainly changes my attitude toward this climate. As I say, I've scratched the surface, and let me mention this little mathematical thing. There are 850 characteristics that must happen for life as we know it to exist. And the probability of that kind of thing happening, probability is 1/10 to the 1/10 to the 1,050 raised to that power, which would mean 1,050 zeros after the one? Isn't that what it would be?
That Bill would know.
Bill,
It's easily at Google.
so, said, well, what is that like for those, how can we understand that? And this astronomer said, it's like a person winning the California lottery 150 times in a row and buying just one ticket each time. So, those are very small odds, aren't they? Pointing to the fact that intelligence, very definitely, intelligence involved in the creation, the putting together of our entire universe and our planet. A number of weeks ago, Dr. Mark Houston led this class in a beautiful lesson on John 1. And in that lesson, he showed the connection between Genesis 1 and John 1. John 1 begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were created through him, through the Word, and not anything that was made. And of course, this Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. In that same gospel, the Word, Jesus, met with a Jewish leader. A Jewish leader was attracted to Jesus. We talked at times past about sinners, overt sinners, being so attracted to Jesus. They were not the only ones. Nicodemus was curious about the things that Jesus was doing and saying, and so he wanted an audience with him, an appointment with him. It was at night, probably in Jerusalem, probably on the upper level of a dwelling in Jerusalem, where he asked Jesus questions. And the image of wind and spirit came up in that conversation. It was probably, what probably prompted that was a little breeze coming across Jerusalem, and Jesus said the wind, and probably pointed to the rustling of the leaves. The wind blows where it will. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. And I'd like to come back to this image that we started with the wind or the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, over the bleak creation where there was no life. And so it's that hovering of God's Spirit that brought forth the riches of creation. That word hovering, it's not in the New Revised Standard Translation, but the Hebrew also can be translated hovering, is like that of a mother bird hovering over her nest. And so Jesus was saying to this first century Jewish leader, the Spirit, the same Spirit that hovered over the face of the desolate waters, is available for you to hover in your life and bring forth from the barrenness of your heart and your life that which is fruitful. Any observation that you'd like to make on these first 3 days of creation?
Would you repeat the word for God's G-A-R-A?
Yes, the verb create. This is the unique word that's only used when God is the subject. Bara.
And is God creating something new?
Yes, God is
We
creating.
all rely on God creating something new in us.
Yes. In fact, what he does in us is called a new creation. He takes the barrenness, the desolation of our hearts and lives and hovers over them. Coming back to the Wesleyan emphasis on prevenient grace, I think God hovers over us in our entire lives. And at times we feel it more, we sense it more than others, but God's intent is to renew what he has created and that he said is very good. Any other observations, Joe?
As you were teaching this wonderful lesson, I was thinking about how we all have a responsibility to care for the earth.
Yes.
And to nurture it and to enhance it. Janine and I are often shocked at how many bags of trash we see along I-65 when we have people that work all day long and do nothing to pick up the trash.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that body of Christ should do is to talk about the importance of loving the creation, caring for it, and enhancing it.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to mention a name in that connection. We all have our part that we do and can do more of in protecting the earth. Several times ago over at 61st Avenue, when we were working with the people at 61st Avenue, Kay and I were sort of the chief cooks and bottle washers that night, and we had these big cans of green beans. You know, you pour all those and cook them and everything. And I was gonna just put those in a black bag and put them out there with the rest of the refuse for the people to take. Ben Sparks said, Steve, he said, I'll take those and I'll recycle them. And he did something to my heart and conscience when he did that. He raised my level of awareness of what I need to do. And so Ben, thank you for the conscience that you bear. One other connection to the environment. There was a young man that played football at Overton High School. 1962 would be his freshman year out there, and 65 would have been his last year. During that time, he could see to the east of what is now the Overton Stadium, and he could see the construction of I-65. And this stirred in his heart a desire to use his gifts, his emerging gifts, to be an engineer. He thought about the transformation that was taking place in this country with the interstate system. And this young man went to engineering school at the University of Tennessee. He was a contemporary of Tom Blows. His name is Chad Holliday. He worked a summer job over at DuPont, and after he graduated from UT, he persuaded them to make his summer job a full-time job. Over the years, Chad Holliday rose to be CEO and chairman of DuPont worldwide. He was later during the financial crisis, Bank of America brought him to New York as chairman of Bank of America. And then in his work there, he was brought to Royal Dutch Shell, an international corporation, and Chad Holliday, who started out there on that football field at Overton High, is one of the leading advocates across the world for doing the very thing, Joe, that you said. He's working with governments, he's working with private industry, with research universities, and as you think about it, pray for this Nashville boy who has done so well and who may yet do us all so good. Any other observations that you have? Yes.
On what,
Doris,
yeah. When Doris was talking about the Barak, in the Shema, it starts out, Baruch atah Adonai melech. It uses God as the subject, it mentions God again in the subject, so that's just something I don't think of.
I'm glad.
It's just one of those things.
I'm grateful for your support on that, because you know that better than I do.
No, I-
You do. Yes.
Steve, for most of us in here, you challenged or tested the minds of us old people. Talking about the creation of the universe and showing us those pictures. I'm struck by what you started with. And God created the heavens and the earth. The earth I can picture, I can understand, but since God is in the heaven, it's hard for me to get my arms wrapped around that, because to me, the heavens have always been, because that's where our God and Savior is. And so that's, He created the heavens. It's like, okay, where were you, Lord God, before you created the heavens?
I think in this sense, in Genesis, as we said, the Genesis writer has an observer down on the surface of the earth, and all that he means by heavens in this instance is just the sky. He's just talking about the created heavens. God dwells in a realm that is uncreated, and that I can't fathom. I can't fathom that. Kay and I have to slip out. Our granddaughter has a soccer match.